Kids, the pod. Well, I'll start over. Welcome back to Speaking for Kids, the podcast for Michigan's children. I'm your host, Matt Gillard, and in today's podcast, we'll talk about the budget politics, and really the fiscal year 24 state budget process as it winds down here for the next month or so. What should advocates know, and how can we advocate for our concerns in the coming few weeks or month as the legislature and the governor finalize our fiscal year state budget for the state of Michigan? Just last week, actually on Friday, state budget negotiators received some expected but somewhat disappointing news that projected revenues for next year and the coming years are expected to be a little bit lower than they were projected back in January. The May Revenue Estimating Conference, which happens every year, was held on Friday, and in particular, the general fund estimates came in significantly down from what was projected back in January, what the governor based her budget proposal on, and what had been, hoped to be really a record surplus for the state of Michigan. Now, there is still money to be spent, make no mistake about it, and the legislature and the governor will have some real interesting decisions to make here in the next few weeks as they finalize a state budget. Certainly before July 1st, that will set our spending levels for the next fiscal year, which starts October 1 of this year. There's some interesting political dynamics weighing in on this process this year as well, with the Democrats now in control of both chambers in the legislature, but the Republicans still influencing some control over the process by having by being able to withhold votes in order to make it more difficult for the budget to take immediate effect. We'll get into those issues and more with our two guests today, who really we want to thank them first for being with us, and really are longstanding experts on this issue and friends of Michigan's children, and two lobbyists that have been working in the Lansing area on children's and family issues for a long time. So with us today, we have Andrea Cascarilla with the Government Policy and Practice Group at Dykema. This is a leading law firm right here in Lansing, and Matt Kurta, a longstanding partner with Karoub and Associates, a leading lobbying firm here in Lansing as well. Thank you both for being with us.
Thank you, Matt. Glad to be here.
Likewise. Thanks, Matt.
Yeah, so thanks. Let's start with you, Andrea. Just kind of give us your take in general on kind of the budget process, where things stand now, some of the things you're looking for as someone who's been involved with this, obviously many times or every year for the past several years, and how you see this playing out here in the short term.
Sure. Yeah. Well, as you said, we were just coming off of CREC last week and the new numbers, and the timing is where we expect, House and Senate have both passed their versions of the budget and prepped those, all the budgets, department budgets to go to conference committee. So now with the new revised revenue estimates, legislative leaders and the executive office, the governor's office, are prepped to negotiate a final budget. And you mentioned also, I think there's strong expectation that will be completed by July 1st. So sometime in June, mid to late June, probably wrapping that budget up for the next fiscal year. And we expect that to include some appropriations for the current fiscal year, 23 fiscal year as well. So, everything seems to be on track. Obviously, some adjustments, as you've mentioned, in those revenue estimates, but not unexpected. So for the most part, revenues are tracking where they were projected to be in January. What we've seen and really impacting that are policies that have been enacted, changing tax policies, changing our revenues. So, the pension tax, the EITC, there have been some corporate tax changes, some other, tax changes, and cumulatively, they do have an impact, and it really is on the general fund, on the school aid fund side. You are seeing, a slight uptick in those numbers, but, a little more positive situation on the school aid fund side. The good news, I think, going into the budget and these final negotiations on a deal is that both the House and Senate passed versions of the budget don't exceed the new revenue estimates. I think there was some expectation as policies, legislation was being passed impacting tax revenues to kind of hold back on some of those budget targets to adjust for that. So there was some thought put in as those policies were being passed so that we're not trying to reel back on the budget, but really there's some stark differences, between the House and Senate overall and within budgets and where those dollars are prioritized. So there will be a lot of negotiation, and I say between the chambers, the House and Senate, but also with the governor's recommendation. So there's certainly going to be that negotiation on what those various programs, whether they're increases or not, or new programs funded, really will be part of that deliberation negotiations. And as you said as well, with, there are Republican votes needed for IE, so they're going to fold into those negotiations on the budget as well.
Yeah, no, that's great. No, that's interesting. And I think that point you made about, even though revenues were down with the, from the conference on Friday, they still weren't below the numbers that the House and Senate passed versions were. So there isn't this concern, overwhelming concern that significant further cuts have to be made over the House and Senate versions that have already passed. So Matt, let's get into the politics about this a little bit. Obviously, one of the big changes this year that we haven't seen in 40 plus years here in Lansing is the Democratic trifecta, right? Where we have the Democrats in control of both chambers of the legislature, as well as the governor's office. And it's been really interesting for myself, and I'm sure for you and others who have been around this for a long time, to kind of see this dynamic play out. And what we really have seen some significant differences from, this process started with the governor's budget proposal back in February. And now the House and Senate have both passed their own versions. And there are some fairly stark differences between the approach that the governor take in a lot of the areas, that we're concerned about, as well as areas across the board for state government. How do you see the politics or the kind of inside baseball playing out here in this dynamic between the legislature and the governor, being, even though that they are all of the same party, clearly button heads a little bit here as we head towards the final stretch of the budget?
Well, for sure, Matt. And as Andrea talked about earlier, let's roll back to January and think that, so now you're Democrats, and for the first time in almost 40 years, you have complete control of state government. So, for years, you've never had the ability to advance an agenda, completely at your direction. You've always had to negotiate things on both sides. As for, a number of years, we've had split partisan control. Under former Governor Snyder, you had, complete Republican control of the legislature. So let's add in a couple things there. Let's add on Democrats after 40 years finally have a chance to be in charge. Then let's layer on redistricting, which was passed by the voters, and we have never seen before, an independent redistricting commission. Both sides see that, of course, differently based on their own perspective. And then you add on, 50, 60, 70 new legislators. And then on top of that, let's add on record one-time revenues that I think many of us who've been around Lansing a long time have never seen. So you have this expectations game of all the priorities that have been pent up for Democrats for years, of things they want to do. And then all of a sudden, the cookie jar is full. So what do we do? But as you noted, Matt, the governor had a direction she laid out at the beginning of the year. And whether planned or not, we've had a number of big ticket items come before the legislature for funding. So I think it's important to remember that, yes, while revenues have dipped, there's still a lot of revenue, available. This was all planned for. And really, as we go around Lansing, there are hundreds and hundreds of ideas here on what to do. When anyone hears government is flush with money, you, of course, are going to come up with ideas and suggestions on what to do with that revenue. And so I think you're not seeing a lot of battles play out in public, as you have seen in years past when you have split control of government. But that's not to say there aren't some differences of opinions with how to utilize these revenues. So I think there's a great opportunity for government to do some big and bold things. I think things that haven't been tried before that probably have some people excited and some people a little worried. But it's important to remember, the budget process plays out until we get to revenue estimating in May, which, of course, for those of us who are, of the Capital Insider crowd, January and May are the big dates of the year when we figure out how much revenue we have. The budget process, the governor starts, she kind of frames the argument, and then the House and Senate kind of respond with their own ideas and proposals. But it's important to recognize until we get to May, those numbers are really just priority setting and proposals, and each side laying out, playing the long game of here's where we're starting, but here's where we want it to end up at the end of the day. So I think there's revenue estimates certainly did not surprise anybody. I think it's no surprise when you spend a lot of money and do some tax cuts, you're going to have an impact on revenues. But I think the next couple of weeks in particular are going to be fascinating, as you have folks who really haven't in the legislature run this process before sit down and figure out how are we going to do this. And one important question we need to keep in mind is procedurally immediate effect. I might be jumping ahead a little bit here, but generally for legislation to take effect immediately, you need a 2/3 vote of both the House and the Senate. Otherwise, if you don't have that, there's a 90-day lag at the end of the session year when legislation takes effect. Obviously, with the budget year starting on October 1st and the school budget year starting July 1st, there's a lot of pressure to get the budget done on time. In the House of Representatives, that really hasn't been much of an issue in years past, as immediate effect is added just through a procedural voice vote. But in the Senate, you need a record roll call vote. And so while Democrats have a 2018 majority, you need 26 votes for immediate effect. So that's where a little politics probably comes into play here in the next month or so. And it sounds very esoteric to those of you in the real world, but for those of us in the bubble, it's something we're all watching very closely.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's dig into that. So really, I mean, as it stands now, it appears to everyone that there's basically two options, right? That the Democrats have. They can either negotiate and negotiate for 6 Republican votes in the Senate for this roll call vote on immediate effect. And that would mean giving, those 6 senators either priorities that they're looking for in the budget or whatever policy issues that they're pursuing, or, an old school political negotiation where you'd have to trade something that these Republicans would want in order to ascertain their vote for immediate effect. That's option one. Option two, which is something that's relatively new or being floated at least more seriously than ever before that I can remember here in Lansing, is the Democrats saying, screw you guys, we're not going to negotiate over immediate effect. You should give us immediate effect on the budget. If you don't want to, screw you. We're going to do what's called the sine die option, which sine die is the end of the legislative session, right? So every year, usually on December 30th, December 31st, or sometime late December, the legislature has a formal process where they close out the legislative session. And then any bills that have passed before that point that have not received immediate effect then become effective 90 days after that period. What they're floating as an option now is that they could do that sine die by the end of June 30th. And that would mean then that the budget bill, having passed but without immediate effect, would go into effect by October 1. That it seems like on its face would solve this immediate effect issue for the budget, but then that means the legislature cannot on their own formally meet for the rest of the calendar year. The legislature's session would be done because of that process. Now, the governor would still be able to call special legislative sessions, but my understanding is that those would only be able to be called around specific issue items that she identified. For those of us on the inside, this is kind of a drastic option, it seems like. I'm not certain that the effect of it would be that big a deal. Ultimately, legislative session in the fall is kind of a crapshoot anyway. I mean, this is not an election year. So typically there would be more legislative session than certainly in an election year. But whether, the Democrats all in control, they could work with the governor in figuring out what they wanted to get done and needed to get done through special sessions may happen. But it's just kind of an interesting dynamic that we haven't seen before. Give me your best guess, both of you, Andrea and Matt, about how you think this plays out. Do we ultimately get to the sine die option, or do they, cooler heads prevail and negotiations kind of take place and we end up where we typically do with the minority party extracting some political capital in exchange for their immediate effect votes?
I'll just say my short answer is I think we negotiate the votes and that gets done through the traditional process. Certainly moving up sine die as an option, and there's a lot of discussion about that theoretically, but I don't think that serves anyone well, and there's a lot of interest, especially on the legislative side, and kind of seeding what that agenda is. I will throw out there, just kind of for deliberation's sake, there is also an option, and my colleague here at Dykema, Steve Liedel, former legal counsel for Governor Granholm, has shared, there is a belief as well, beyond just calling special, setting sine die and calling a special session. Another option would be to call a special session on a non-session day. So you don't move up sine die, but you move up a special session and allows for a different process to take place. But even given that, I'll just say, I really do believe on both sides of the aisle, there is in the legislature an interest to come together and negotiate. And I think a lot of, we've seen there's been a lot of posturing up to this point. We're just in the kind of first phase of the budget. Now that we're moving into those true negotiations, now that we're past crack, bills are in conference. And I think you're going to see that really honest dialogue and negotiations to reach an agreement, and there's mutual benefit from both sides in moving forward with that path.
What do you think, Matt? You agree?
I would agree with Andrea there. As fun as it would be for us to disagree, we're all in the practice of trying to figure out, as we sit here on May 22nd, what happens, and now we can look back on this in a few months and find out if we're right or wrong. But I'm sure as some of your listeners are watching you, Matt, explain what could happen here, the eyes probably started to roll a little bit, yeah. and glaze over. And we're all playing this game too. I mean, we are trying to game out, if they don't hammer out a deal, what happens. And there's so many things that you try to walk backwards from. We just don't know yet, but there is a possibility. We've seen some unprecedented things so far this year, but I would agree with Andrea. I think ultimately they find a way to get this done. There's a lot of options available to make some deals, and going down this road is a heck of a precedent, and also a precedent we don't really have a lot of experience with. I think the last time a special session was called was in the 60s at some point here. So it would be fascinating political theater, but I think they figure out a way to get it done.
Yeah, I think I would agree with you as well. It gives us something to talk about, but at the end of the day, you would hope that they'd be able to figure that out. All right, well, let's leave that immediate effect to the side. Let's talk about a couple other things that are of note to me, and maybe I think to a lot of the folks that we partner with and that are interested in these issues. I'm going to kind of package these together, even though they're separate, but maybe we can talk about them somewhat together. So one of the things that's been really kind of interesting from that we've noticed in the budgets that have passed from the House and the Senate is the amount of spending, and this is obviously because we have increased revenues and we're not talking about cuts, but almost special project spending, right? Where we're seeing, as a former legislator, I would have loved to have been able to, unfortunately I served at a time when the budgets were the opposite way and we were cutting everything, but I would have been loved to be, fighting for a swimming pool at my local school and other things. And there's a level of this that you see a little bit of every year, but it's gone really, I think, beyond anything I've seen in the past, kind of special project funding and things in these legislative proposals to this point. Now, obviously, we're not to the finish line yet. But so question one would be, what do you think? How do you see that ultimately playing out in the final negotiations? Are we going to end up with a final budget that has a bunch of line item spending for specific projects in communities? Or does most of that stuff get wiped out in the final negotiations? And then kind of related to that, one of the things we've seen in the last several years, especially, is more and more at the end of the day, more and more of these negotiations happening at the very top, right? Amongst really the legislative leadership, and less even the subcommittee chairs or individual rank and file members being involved, and the final products being more and more worked out either by the full approach chairs and the governor's office or the leadership itself in the governor's office. obviously a lot of that was under Republican control in the legislature. Do you see that same type of dynamic or scenario playing out now that the Democrats have control in the legislature, where everything's pushed up to the top and the leader's offices or the speaker's office or the majority leader's office are negotiating all of these final details out with the governor? Or is the process more inclusive for individual members to be a part of these final negotiations? So I know it's kind of a two-part question, but I think those are both, from our standpoint, from a children and families advocacy perspective, these are both important points as we head into this final piece here.
Yeah, would you like me to lead on that?
Sure. Go ahead, Andrea.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll start with kind of your second question first. I do think it may be a little different this year in that you'll have subcommittee chairs are, I think both chairs in the House and Senate were very clear in communicating to subcommittee chairs, wanting them to really kind of have ownership over those budgets. It was something they heard about, and there was a lot of frustration the last few years where you've definitely seen just a handful of folks in the room that ultimately decide budgets, and you have a subcommittee process that really almost kind of gets thrown out the window and kind of reevaluate that whole budget and very different outcomes. And so, I think there's been a conscious effort this year with the Democratic chairs, the new Democratic appropriations chairs, to really try to restore a lot of that decision-making to the subcommittee chairs all the way through the process. And there'll be some discretion that leadership shows in ultimate negotiations, but I think they've tried to really listen to the chairs and let them set priorities and really look to honor a lot of that. But again, there are differences between the House and Senate, and those have to be resolved, but I think more of an opportunity for those chairs to do that and then see much of what they negotiate being the ultimate product for that budget. But again, at the end of the day, it always ends up being, it comes down to those folks. We've moved to omnibus budgets, and getting an agreement on that full budget deal is important with both across the aisle with the governor, across the board there. So it is a little bit of a change of what we've seen in the last few years. And I'll just, my thoughts on, as you talked about kind of these special projects, the unprecedented surplus revenues have driven a lot of that. Typically, I think we saw some of that at the, end of the year, if there was, in a supplemental, and you might see some of that, not to the degree we've seen in the last couple of years, and that's really the historic surpluses we've the state's realized, and the eagerness to spend those dollars, and especially in districts. And so in district on projects, I do think because with the new revenue estimates and the some of the reductions there, you may see that reduced a bit. That's something that we haven't really seen. We know requests have been made, and we expect to see that again. But that may be an area where we see shaped off a little bit in the budget on how much is spent on special projects. But that will never probably go away in the budget process. It's important for legislators to address kind of very specific needs in their community, and that's the opportunity to do so.
What do you think, Matt? What do you think about the process, or is it going to be more inclusive with Democratic leadership? And what about all these swimming pools?
Well, I think it has been more inclusive. The challenge is, I'll go back to the point I made earlier. You have so many new people. They're trying to get a handle on the process. I mean, imagine if you are a new legislator and you're handed a giant budget like K-12 or Health and Human Services, something like that, and you're getting up to speed, and you may have been around a couple years and some parts of it, but that takes a lot of time and effort to get there. So I do think the K-12, for K-12 and HHS, I mentioned those because they're large budgets. I think that subcommittee chairs have been given a little more latitude than in years past. Now, remember, we're comparing years past to a global pandemic where you can make an argument that, in these unprecedented times, how do you have a robust subcommittee process? But I think that subcommittee chairs have always been given a little bit of leeway. I think they've been given a little bit more leeway this time around. But ultimately, when you get together and hammer out a budget, everyone is kind of given guardrails within which they need to operate and target dollar amounts within which they need to appropriate. So I think it's been a little more inclusive this time around. We'll see how it shapes up at the end. And as far as special projects, one person's special project is another person's priority, is another person's critical need. I think that that bottle has been opened a few years ago, and I think that genie's not going back in the bottle anytime soon.
Yeah, I think it's probably just my jealous and envy that makes me bring it up in situations or opportunities like this. Well, I want to take this opportunity again to thank both Matt Kurta and Andrea Cascarilla for being longtime friends and partners of Michigan's Children and all that we do, but specifically for joining us here today on this podcast and giving all of you listeners some insight kind of into this budget process. It's going to be a very interesting and dynamic month here in Lansing as all of this shakes out and we ultimately get an agreement between the legislature and the governor moving forward in a fiscal year 2024 state budget that hopefully we can all be happy about, and that starts to fund some of the priorities that we know kids and families here in Michigan need. So stay tuned again next month or tune in again next month for another exciting edition of Speaking for Kids, where we'll bring important insights and information about another issue or topic that's relevant to the work that you're doing in the communities right here from our state capital in Lansing. Thanks for joining us. All right. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you.
That was perfect. Like I said, we'll get this package